Let's talk about some of the strongest things that the Astartes can put on the tabletop right now, with a look at 7 strong Space Marine army lists in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought we'd take a look at a bunch of different Space Marine army lists and the units and choices that good players have been choosing to put on the tabletop to achieve some success at big tournaments at the moment. Space Marines in game at the moment seem to be in a bit of a weird place, as they often tend to be really. The overall army win rates are in theory quite well balanced, around about 47% since the previous balance update, and they certainly seem to be getting their fair share of outright tournament victories as well, and they still seem to be fairly popular to put on the table, pretty well joint top most played army with Adeptus Custodes. It does feel like to play them in their strongest form though, the vast majority of armies tend to be playing Ultramarines, and specifically Ultramarines with Rebute Guilliman is maybe more notable for the list that choose not to include Guilliman rather than the ones that do. I must admit in the last balance update it did seem like a bit of a weird decision when Games Workshop basically just increased Guilliman Calgar by 10 points but left Guilliman untouched, and instead decided to raise a whole bunch of other Space Marine units points cost, which only really underlines Guilliman and the Ultramarines as the strongest way to play the army. Besides the Ultramarines casting the rest of the chapter somewhat in their shadow though, there's at least a fair amount of detachments that get plays. The Gladius Task Force is by far the most played Space Marine detachment in competitive currently, though quite a bit of the rest do have at least some people trying them out and playing them. Ironstorm, Vanguard and Firestorm are perhaps the next most popular. Stormlance has been doing okay as well, and a few people have been using the Librarius one. In any case, for this video I thought we could take a look at what people have been doing well with Space Marines on the tabletop, take a look at a whole bunch of top tournament placings and the units that were used, with 7 examples of strong army lists. First up, I thought we'd start with the fast-moving Space Marines of the Stormlance Task Force. This one's the kind of White Scars themed one, the core rule giving the whole army advance and charge all the time, which is just quite nice for any melee unit out there. You don't need to worry about certain units flexing into it in Gladius, and you can also fall back and charge as well. Otherwise, perhaps the single biggest stratagem might be that reactive move of 6 inches one. If the enemy moves close, then your units can move away. They did limit that one to just be infantry and bikes though, so no longer for Primarchs, and otherwise they have ones for the durability at range versus mounted and fly units, the assault keyword for shooting attacks, and then some mounted specific ones with things like reroll charges and gaining lance, and 2 command points to auto advance 9 inches. Unfortunately the bike synergies just don't seem to be great for Codex Space Marines though, given that Outriders just don't really have enough power to carry themselves as a big damage and defense unit, and if you want to use mounted units it tends to be the Dark Angels or Space Wolves that might do a bit better for that. For a couple of examples of Stormlance lists, and for a rare example of a non-Ultramarines one doing well, this one by Dan Richards was used to take 4th at Vanquish 2025, a 47-player grand tournament, and he used this to win 4 games out of 5. Cool to see some Imperial Fist on the table, and this army is led by Darnath Lysander, the big Terminator captain that gives you a -1 to wound for his squad. And as the core of the list, there's 2 enormous Terminator assault squads with hammers and shields, really big indomitable Space Marine units that are hard to take down and hit hard in melee. Lysander has his own big hit in close combat and -1 to wound. There's a Terminator captain leading the other one that can get some free stratagems. I guess that reactive move one will be good. And then it looks like both of those squads are joined by Ancients and Terminator armor, so more OC to grab the midboard with them, and they'll trigger some damage buffs as the squads take casualties, which feels a bit more relevant on the Terminator assault squads, given that they're really big and survivable, and there's a pretty reasonable chance that they might be damaged but not outright destroyed. One of them also has Portent of Wisdom as well, rerolling advanced rolls for his units, and that could be helpful for extending their threat range a bit more reliably. Overall, it feels like most of the rest is supporting for that. There's a unit of Intercessors with their sticky objectives and anti-horde shooting, 2 jump Intercessors, good for their secondary objectives, and advance and charge here doesn't hurt either. A squad of 3 Outriders, so at least 1 mounted unit in the army. 2 squads of Scouts with Bolters, good to see an all-very Imperial Fist loadout for them there. Nice and cheap to start in the midfield and scrap for objectives there. A Combi Weapon Lieutenant, a really common disruption unit that can also mark a midfield objective for some reroll wound rolls, and then 2 big sturdy Vindicators for some hard-hitting anti-tank fire support, and I guess also adding to the big wall of 2+ armor that's going to be walking at you. It's certainly fun to see Terminator assault squads doing well in a competitive list. Terminators in general haven't really tended to be having the best time of it recently. They are one of the tankiest Space Marine units though, with their 4 wounds and big invulnerable saves, and great big units like that can be pretty powerful for any stratagems or buffing options for them, and they get on pretty well with Armour of Contempt as well. I guess potentially you could rapid ingress some of them, I wouldn't be too surprised if they were just walking across the board in Stormlance though, so that if the enemy puts things on the midboard objectives they could be threatening first turn charges potentially. Otherwise, for a couple of strong supporting units, Scouts are a dead common include in strong army lists. 70 points for 5 Space Marines in the midboard, pretty nice and expendable, and they can do secondary objectives early or starting cover on primaries if it makes sense, and having the Scout keyword means they can potentially go aggressive if for some reason it should make sense, potentially mauling some enemy light infantry turn 1. Return to reserves can be handy for secondaries later in the game as well if they should happen to survive. Otherwise in this list, a Combi Weapon Lieutenant again seems to be just dead common in Space Marine army lists. 70 points for the Space Marine Lone Operative. Cheap lone operatives just have a lot of value as a unit that you can't interact with at long range, so he can deny one area of the board to deep strikes, do secondary objectives, or maybe even contest primary objectives that the enemy isn't going for. The Combi Lieutenant is just notable for being really hard to catch up with. If you move within 9 inches, then he can do a reactive move, so just goes to the other side of a ruin so he can't be shot or something, meaning that you probably need to commit more resources than you really want to if you actually want to destroy him. Moving on to another Stormlance list though, and this one's by John Lennon, and as with most of the competitive army lists right now, is an Ultramarines list with Repulsors Guilliman and Marnius Calgar. It was used to place second in the Grand Onslaught GT, going 5 wins to no losses. The majority of Ultramarines lists start with Repulsors Guilliman and Marnius Calgar. I'll focus on them in just a second, but they can keep a ridiculous amount of stratagems flowing and have good close combat value besides that. And again, there's a Combi Lieutenant here who can have some additional value when Repulsors Guilliman's around, as he can potentially trigger his lone operative rule while being a lone operative himself. Aside from them though, this one definitely makes some very different choices to a bunch of the other competitive army lists. Probably the single coolest thing is a Storm Raven gunship despite its big points cost, taking multi-melters, plasma cannons and hurricane bolters, and I guess Stormlance might help it out a bit more than most, particularly with that -1 to hit and wound stratagem, which could be a good durability one if you wanted it. Apparently that Storm Raven was used to transport some Assault Centurions up the board, like the Terminators not super commonly played, but they can hit very very hard against tanks and vehicles, and they do need something to get them close. And then for some supporting Space Marine vehicle fire support, there's a pair of Ballistus Dreadnoughts, and then 2 Storm Speeder Hammer Strikes, with their close range melter weapons and ability to strip cover away. Kind of unusual to see 2 of them, it's more often just 1, partly for the special rule, but between them and potentially double Oath of Moment, that's going to be a firebase that can take down some seriously tough stuff. Then for the rest of the list, there's a good amount of supporting units, some Intercessors again for sticky objectives, company heroes to go with Marnius Calgar, 5 Incursors, 4+1 to hit against something, a squad of Outriders, again a detachment focus unit, and nice enough skirmishers, and 1 squad of Space Marine Scouts. Let's talk about those big strategic Ultramarines characters though, and as mentioned, Repulsors Guilliman seems to be near enough auto-include for the Space Marines. 345 points, and brings a lot to the table for that, between his buffing rules and his own melee stat line. First up, he hands out double Oath of Moment, so nominating 2 targets, and if you destroy the first one, then it activates on the second one. When Oath of Moment is 4 rolls to hit and +1 to wound, that's just crazy value, and provided nothing goes awry and you don't swing and miss against your first target, it can lead to some pretty crazy serious damage. Otherwise, he gets 2 sets of free stratagems, 1 in your turn and 1 in the enemy turn, and they can apply to unusual units within 12 inches, so it can help out things like monsters and vehicles, and that's really got lots of different value depending on the different attachments as well. Depending on what strats are on offer, then he's got a massive melee profile that should be able to take out some of the toughest stuff in the game, and the Armour of Fate, which means that if the opponent just goes for him in a big way and risks some things to try and take him down, odds are he is just going to get up and kill that thing dead. It's not reliable from the Ultramarine player's point of view, but reliable enough to the point where it's going to give the opponents a pause. He's often paired with Marnius Calgar as well still. He went up to 200 points in the last balance update, but this really doesn't seem to have deterred people from him. He gives you an extra command point per turn, so again is going to keep loads of stratagems flowing, and basically makes his unit into one chunky Death Star of a squad, a bunch of damage 3 attacks personally, and lots more quality melee from the Victrix Honor Guard, and the squad's quite mobile as well, with advance and charge, fallback and charge, and the same for shooting. He generally tends to be paired with company heroes. Again, they got a 10-point bump, but doesn't seem to have deterred them from their combo with Calgar. Just over 100 points gives you 4 guys with 4 wounds and -1 to wound, plus some alright OC and a bit of melee in their own right with the champion, and the overall chunky combo between these and the command point farming still seems to be very much the go-to for Space Marines. As we'll see, Calgar and Guilliman certainly feature in a bunch of other lists. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor, Baron of Dice. They're a high quality dice maker based in the USA, and made some rather fun and fancy merch dice for the channel, and asked to sponsor some videos to showcase their range. They've got a pretty enormous amount of dice aimed at wargaming, the idea being that they could tie in with all sorts of factions, both from Warhammer 40k and further afield, and they certainly have plenty of tropes that could apply to various different chapters. In general, they're aimed more towards the sort of luxury end of the dice market. I personally feel like they've got really quite a nice feel to them, and they do roll well. I was certainly pleased with the Auspex ones that he made. A lot of the designs are available in rounded or squared corners. In general, the typical price for the dice tend to be around about £28 or $32, and that gets you 25 of them. There's an Auspex discount code for 5% off, so use that at checkout if you did pick something up. I'll link the channel dice below as well if anyone wants some shiny ones with the Auspex logo on. It was cool to see those get made. Otherwise, if you want to check out their range, there'll be links down in the video description, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. Next up though, let's talk about the big one. As mentioned, the Gladius Task Force does seem to be the most popular competitive Space Marine detachment right now. It's perhaps the most standard and sort of Index and Ultramarines flavoured one, with the core rule being the 3 combat doctrines: Devastator, Tactical and Assault, Advance and Shoot, Advance and Charge, and Fallback, Shoot and Charge, and then any unit can flex into them for 1 command point, which is perhaps just as impactful as the core rule itself. Otherwise, there's stratagems for lance melee, reactive moves, ignores cover when shooting, and getting better in various ways in their own doctrine, and also a fights on death one. The enhancements are alright as well: the Honour Vehement for a melee character, Artificer Armour for a tough character, and Fire Discipline to add some sustained hits into a shooting unit. For a first example for a recent successful Gladius list, this one by Justin Francis was used to take third at a tournament called Rosehammer, going 5-1 at a 70 player event. And as with the other Ultramarines Gladius ones, again it starts with Guilliman Calgar, so a vast amount of extra stratagems that you're going to be able to use between Guilliman's free ones and Calgar's generated command points. Calgar is of course paired with his company heroes. One of the most interesting ones out of this list is the Lieutenant with Intercessors combo. I've certainly not seen people using that, but basically that to be 40 shots out of the Intercessors plus some grenade launchers and a Lieutenant Combi bolter, all with lethal hits and sustained hits, as the Lieutenant has Fire Discipline, and it seems like the perfect unit to use Storm of Fire on for ignores cover and potentially getting the extra AP from Devastator. Particularly with Oath of Moment, that'll be enough shots to stack a massive amount of wounds on just about anything. Though obviously it's going to be utterly lethal to Horde style units. Any 1 wound infantry are just going to get evaporated by that. Otherwise, for other big damage punches, there's a unit of 6 Inceptors with plasma, deep striking at 6 inches, and then good damage output. Again, particularly if you give them one of Guilliman's copies of the Oath of Moment to get their work done. Can both be good for hitting things that they normally wouldn't be able to hit, and also maybe getting into places for things like secondary missions. There's 2 Vindicators, which will certainly love the extra Oath of Moment going around as well. And then for support units, there's a unit of Infiltrators that I guess will be joined by the Phobos Librarian. That'll give you a squad to mine the home field that can stop enemy reserves and also not be shot at greater than 12 inches. A unit of Incursors that can give you a +1 to hit against certain targets that you might need. A Combi Weapon Lieutenant once more. And then interestingly, 2 squads of 5 Reavers armed with combat knives. Cool to see them getting played in competitive lists again. Really quite cheap deep striking units that do have some actual okay threats now they've got a bit of AP, and they have the potential to annoy certain things on objectives now with their cancelling objective control thing. It's definitely cool to see some Intercessors fielded as a big 10-man squad. In general though, for most competitive lists they just tend to be maybe in a single squad of 5 of them for the 80 points. Really quite an efficient unit to add into a list, each one spitting out 4 fairly punchy bolt shots with AP1 if they all focus at the same thing, plus a grenade launcher and a power fist. And then they have the sticky objectives rule, which is pretty helpful to be able to put on the home field one, and then maybe if they're lucky move towards the midfield with their extra OC and score something there if they can. Just getting 20 bolt shots can be exactly what you need sometimes though to take out a light infantry unit. Otherwise, for supporting units, Infiltrators are still really common, 100 points for a squad of 5 of them, and they can often be tasked to deny deep strike into your home field, 5 of them spreading out to block things off at 12 inches and hopefully get nowhere near your home objective. And then in games where that doesn't matter so much, you could think about just using them as a more aggressive unit, maybe putting them in the mid-board where at least they're somewhat tanky with their feel no pain type saves. Generally only small units of them are wanted though, as their damage output doesn't do much. Otherwise for Gladius though, there seems to be one meta list that seems to have won a bunch of big events. Looks like at least 3 grand tournaments have been taken down by this army list specifically, which while maybe it's not crazily creative, I feel like you wouldn't really change the vibe of it too much by swapping around certain units for other things. Certainly demonstrates that this list is pretty much peak Space Marine right now. Going pretty heavily in on massive tank and dreadnought shooting damage output with the Ultramarines buffs and a few select support units. Again, there's Guilliman and Calgar at the centre of the list, and Calgar with the company heroes, and they're leading a rather fearsome gun line of 3 Ballistus dreadnoughts, 2 Vindicators with their big hitting anti-tank, and 1 Gladiator Reaper with its massive amount of anti-infantry fire, with good Oath of Moment and stratagem support for all of those due to the amount of command points that are flying around. Then there's some of the staple support units, 1 unit of scouts, an Invader ATV taking a multi-melter, nice cheap and fast and expendable for 60 points, and at least takes a bit of focus fire to bring it down, 1 squad of Infiltrators and a Combi Lieutenant. One of the other most interesting and slightly weird things about this particular meta list is the Gravis caption as well, which I think is kind of fun. He's just running completely solo as a fighty character who's just kind of weirdly tanky with the Artificer armor and his own datasheet rule. Just enough damage and defense to get the job done on his own without any sort of supporting squad it seems. Obviously just being a good list doesn't diminish the player skill that it takes to win grand tournaments with it. It looks like it was used by Sam Nash to take first at the Goonhammer Open. The same list was used by Conan Jennings to win Adepticon as well. That was the one with the close final with Inari that ultimately seemed to be an Ultramarines victory due to the Inari player clocking out. and then it's also been used by Toby Bennett to win the East Anglian GT. Between all that, certainly looks like this one's one of the strongest ways to run Space Marines currently. Given the success of this one, it looks like the nerfs to the Ballistus Dreadnought and the Vindicator haven't really been felt too badly. The Ballistus Dreadnought's pretty much the walking gun turret from the Leviathan box, 2 big missile shots and some las cannons, and you can trade the missile shots for some more anti-infantry if that makes sense. It gets big hitting inbuilt rerolls, where you can reroll hits against units that are greater than half strength, so maybe not one of the absolutely most optimal targets from Oath of Moment, though the missile launcher with its sort of mid-strength will still get on with that really well. Perhaps more than damage output though, it's just a bit more standout for its durability, presenting a wall of 2+ armor saves at relatively cheap to the opponent, particularly intimidating when combined with Vindicators. Speaking of which, still looks like they're really effective as a durable Space Marine gun tank. Toughness 11 and 11 wounds with a 2+ save once more, and they get the big scary Demolisher Cannon, D6 plus 3 shots, strength 14, AP 3 and damage D6. A little bit random with the D6 rolls, but there's a good chance that you could convert the vast majority of the shots that you get if you're re-rolling hits with Oath and then +1 to wound, so you're wounding most vehicles on 2+ most of the time. I did find the Gravis Captain an interesting include as well. For his base datasheet, I'd say is usable but maybe not crazy standouts. He's got 6 wounds at toughness 6 with a 4+ invulnerable save, and his special rule refused to yield half the damage of attacks that get through his armour, which maybe isn't quite as vital if he's in a big squad, as he's going to be the last one to get targeted there. In Gladius though, for an extra 10 points you can buy him the Artificer armour, and that gets him a 2+ save, which is pretty handy against small arms and things, and also a 5+ feel no pain, and halving damage comboed with 5+ feel no pain means that just loads of damage that passes through his armour just completely goes away. Finally though, for a third take on Gladius, this list by Colin Kay plays third at Montana Beer Hammer, and this one's going sort of hilariously heavy on Ultramarines Hero Hammer, maybe starting with some of the obvious ones and then just going far beyond that. As normal, there's Calgar and Guilliman, Calgar looking like he'd be joining those Combi heroes once again. But then beyond that, there's a whole bunch of interesting stuff. There's Uriel Ventress, who I guess will be leading the other set of company heroes, so another tanky brawler unit in the midboard, and looks like he'd be giving his deep strike to a unit of 6 Eradicators, and they're paired with an Apothecary Biologist with Fire Discipline, so basically you could have a massive anti-tank strike just drop in from the skies and blast an enemy vehicle to Kingdom Come there. Then there's a pair of Sternguard veteran squads, which I'm guessing here are basically primarily used to just outright nuke an Oath of Moment targets. It looks like one squad would get Chief Librarian Tigurius, and the other one will get a regular captain on foot with a Power Fist and the Honour Vehement. They're both really quite dangerous characters, and with the Sternguard buffs on the go against an Oath of Moment targets, they will be re-rolling the hit roll, re-rolling the wound roll, and also +1 to wound. It does mean the Sternguard will be shooting somewhat hard with all their devastating wound weapons, but between the Power Fist on the Sternguard Sergeant and the melee of the character, particularly with the Captain's Relic and the boosted attacks once per game, they're just going to do absolutely horrendous damage to even some of the very scariest stuff in the game. Then there's a unit of Infiltrators with a Phobos Librarian, again going character investment, so they're just basically non-interactive on the home objective. You can't deep strike close to them, and you can't shoot them at long range. There's a unit of Inceptors, again big damage against Oath if needed, an Impulsor that could either be used I guess to transport some Sternguard with the Honour Vehement Captain, or maybe Uriel Ventress' squad. And then as if there weren't enough characters, there's also an allied Calidus Assassin who can bounce around the board doing some secondary objectives. Overall looks like a pretty fun list, going really top heavy on all the character combos. Definitely not a lot of durability, so you'd have to play very cagey behind terrain, otherwise you'd be losing expensive characters and squads fast though. Moving on though, let's talk about a Vanguard Task Force 1. Their core rule is -1 to hit and the benefit of cover to all units greater than 12 inches away, so a fairly nice counter range one. And then quite a lot of good support stratagems. A return to reserves one is particularly nice, allowing certain units to warp around the table, good for things like Inceptors or Centurions. There's a reactive move when charged, a firepower one for a +1 to hit and extra AP when shooting things 12 inches away or more, a sticky objectives one and a precision melee option. Pretty well all the enhancements are usable enough, though I'd say most of them not necessarily auto-include. Things like Infiltrate for the bearer's unit, Stealth and Lone Operative, a move shoot move one and a command point disruption one. For one example of a Vanguard list that did well recently, this one by Brandon Robbie placed 5th at the Rocky Mountain Open, just taking 1 loss in 6 games at a massive great big 200 odd player tournament. Interestingly enough, this one is still Ultramarines with Calgar on the board, though no Guilliman for once. At least on paper it does feel like if you weren't to use them in an army list, maybe Vanguard or perhaps Librarius would be the ones where he might not have quite the level of value he does elsewhere. Guilliman Calgar still there though, with the command points and his company heroes, and he's joined by a Phobos librarian, presumably for some of those infiltrators, and the Combi weapon lieutenant picks up the execute and redeploy one this time, so he can move across the board dead fast with his move shoot move. Lots of Vanguard army lists tend to go really quite heavy on the Inceptors. They just work out quite well for them, as they can make good use of that +1 to hit and extra AP stratagem, and also the return to reserves. If they're not dealt with, then they can do 6-inch deep strikes multiple times per game, and that could be seriously nasty. This list goes absolutely all out on them though. 2 sets of 6 Inceptors with the Plasma Exterminators, and then 1 set of 6 with the Assault Bolters. Between all that, that's just a pretty brutal amount of firepower to be jumping out of Deep Strike. Armies that want to focus on hitting you first as opposed to being hit first are really not going to like that. As well as that, there's a small unit of Centurion Devastators with las cannons and missiles. They dropped down to 165 points. I did suspect they'd still be pretty usable in Vanguard, even if their combo with Uriel Ventris was broken. They can also use the return to reserve stratagem really nicely here. There's good support on the Phobos front with 2 units of 5 scouts, so some good units in the midboard, and they could run away in a big way if they're charged with the 6-inch recoil one, and the same for a couple of units of infiltrators as well, so there's a massive amount of deep strike denial, I guess, to cover the home field mainly. As if there weren't enough units to threaten jumping off the table, there's also an allied Calidus assassin as well that could do some secondaries and provide some command point disruption. And then perhaps one of the more interesting choices is a Desolation squad, providing a bit of Space Marine indirect fire with the Vanguard launcher and the Castellan launchers. I guess there might be a reasonable choice against things like Inari these days, with lots of on-foot aspect warriors that really aren't going to want to get hit by Desolation squads, and could be a good Oath of Moment target to do something big with that first turn as well. Inceptors certainly felt like the dominant unit of that list. At 120 points, they do get some semi-regular play in competitive armies. I feel like perhaps outside of Vanguard, they may be a little bit more common in small units with the 6-inch deep strike, paying a premium to disrupt the enemy, jump behind enemy lines, threaten secondaries or small units, but certainly seems like big squads are viable too. When they do their signature drop, they've either got the option of Plasma Exterminators or Assault Bolters, both of them pretty good depending on the targets. Seems that a few more have been going for Plasma Exterminators in these lists, though if you're firing against things like Marine equivalents or lighter, the Assault Bolters will outperform with their big sustained hits too. As mentioned, very nice in Vanguard with their return to reserves and the extra ballistic skill and AP stratagem if they want, and they could be one good user of Oath of Moment as well. Just given that you're paying a premium to put their damage exactly where you want it, you can amp that damage up to be even scarier. Finally, we've got a list for the Ironstorm Spearhead, a Space Marine tank vehicle and dreadnought focused one. That again tends to be one of the more commonly played. It is interesting to see things like those very tank and dreadnought heavy lists doing really well in Gladius Task Force though too. The core rule that you get is a single reroll per attacking unit, so nice for big scary heavy guns like Vindicators or Laser Destroyers. And then as well as the ever valuable Armour of Contempt, there's options for the big 2 command point sustained hits 5+ for a vehicle or firing down against 1 target, a general purpose walker stat buff, returns fire when a vehicle is brought below half health, ignores modifiers, and an automatic deadly demise one. Pretty much all of the enhancements are at least usable as well, even if they were toned down from their original Codex print. 1 vehicle nearby gaining lethal hits, 1 vehicle being able to advance and shoot or fall back and shoot with Master of Machine War, 1 failed save nearby becomes damage 0, and a 4+ feel no pain durability character 1. For one list that did well using that detachment recently, at another really big super major winning grand tournament, was this one by Zach Point, who took first at the Battle to End Alzheimer's, going 6-0 at an 150 player tournament. Again, it's the usual Ultramarines with Calgar and Guilliman. I feel like their command point stratagems are extra appreciated by this detachment, particularly with wanting to use that sustained hits one quite a bit. They make using that a fair bit easier. And then there's 2 Techmarines to support the vehicles with their +1 to hit and their repairs and things. 1 taking Adept of the Omnissiah to cancel some failed saves. 1 the target Augury Web, so you can give 1 vehicle basically sustained hits and lethal hits on a 5+ if desired. Then for the main fire base of this list, it's made up of no less than 3 Repulsor Executioners, great big solid gun tanks with a bunch of anti-infantry shots to clear out lighter stuff, and then 2 of them are taking those enormous and scary laser destroyers, and 1 taking the macroplasma. That certainly got a fair bit more interesting after Oath of Moment got boosted with the +1 to wound. Then, and maybe being on point to take some hits, is a Redemptor Dreadnought. That takes macroplasma and Onslaught Gatling Cannon, and could be a nice one to repair as well, given that it has the -1 damage, so its wounds are hard to take out. And then perhaps most unusually, the only support unit they've got is a 10-man tactical squad. They look like they're taking 2 plasma guns, a power fist and a plasma pistol in their unit, and looks like they're being split in 2 with combat squads and going in a pair of rhinos. I'm not 100% sure as to the logic for that one as opposed to other stuff. I guess it gets you a fair bit more cheap armour on the board to absorb some anti-tank fire, plus some cheap OC2 bodies when they pile out. I feel like more lists that I've seen tend to go with the more tried and tested things like Scouts and Intercessors and Infiltrators and things though. Either way though, certainly proves that they can be played at the highest level of the game, and certainly fun to see some firstborn troop representation. The sheer bulk and damage output of the Repulsor Executioner certainly makes it a really great fit for Ironstorm. One massive heavy gun, a heavy onslaught Gatling cannon and a defensive array just mean that you've got loads of guns to buff if you go for sustained hits or these shoots back, and 3 of them's a really intimidating firebase. They're not going to be going down too easily on the defensive either, with toughness 12 and 16 wounds with access to armour of contempt and smoke. They'll certainly get on well with those Techmarines as well. Speaking of which, Techmarines certainly don't tend to be in every list that goes vehicle heavy, but they're definitely not a wrong choice if you do, and very central in Ironstorm Spearhead. 55 points for a cheap support character, plus 1 to wound and healing D3 lost wounds for their vehicle charges, and then can just be a nuisance character that can annoy the enemy and do secondary objectives and things if needed. And I like the way that they go into rage mode if a vehicle nearby is blown up, suddenly getting weirdly punchy for the cost with a big attacks characteristic of 7 with that Omniscient Axe. In any case though, I'll leave that one there for now. That's 7 examples of strong Space Marine army lists, and as ever, interesting to see what's working on the top tables. There's definitely interesting differences in the list, though maybe it does feel a bit wearing that the vast majority of them start with Guilliman and Calgar. It would be a lot nicer if there were lots of other chapters represented, with Games Workshop managing to not make the other chapters just offer less. Cool to see a little bit of Imperial Fist representation though. Let me know your thoughts on the armies or any insights as to how they might have been played down in the comments below as always. A big thank you to Baron of Dice for sponsoring the video as mentioned. If you want a whole bunch of fancy army logo dice, then feel free to check them out, link down in the video description. As mentioned, they do have a whole bunch of different designs that could be appropriate to fit in with a vast amount of 40k armies and factions. Use that code Auspex for 5% off if you get anything from them. Otherwise, I'll leave that there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly have more on the way for the Space Marines, no doubt. And if you'd like to help support the channel and keep the videos coming, there's affiliate discount links in the video description for cheaper Warhammer when you pick things up, plus the channel's Patreon page if you'd like to support more directly there. In any case though, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.